like you said, you can't have somebody as a spy in Germany, but everyone speaks English. I know they've done that before in movies, but yeah, it kind of makes it a little unauthentic, if you ask me.
Hello, and welcome to the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Chasen, and like always, I'll be joined today by the team that brings you cupofteacritiques.com. Here, we'll dive deep into the productions and topics we broach on our website, so you can decide for yourself if they're your cup of tea. Ready for a deep look with a deep brew? This week's topic, dubbing versus subtitles. Cup of Tea Critiques is a family affair, and I'm here with my brother Chris, my mother Eva, and my father Terry. Wanting to discuss the change from the time when we would dub over like Japanese films like Godzilla to how we are even having American talent playing foreign characters or speaking in their native dialects for movies. Based on the movies that I watch, I have noticed that there's less dubbing, which is nice for me personally because I enjoyed those Godzilla movies when I was a kid, but I realized this as I got older, I got distracted. Because anybody that's watched one of those old Godzilla movies knows that when you watch somebody speaking Japanese and it's like, it looks like they're saying 19 words and it's, hi, Bill, it did not line up. And as a kid, you can laugh through it, but as an adult, after a while, you're sitting here like, come on now, y'all couldn't have done better than that. But fast forward to today now, and you know, I do, of course, watch a lot of action movies. I enjoy the Marvel Universe and everything like that, among other movies. I obviously have a wide variety. But I love that it seems like they're trying to showcase so much more of every culture that's involved in a piece. Even for something that's an action movie, they're going in as spies. They have to speak the native language there, and we have to read the captions. I like it better that way than, you know, I just would not find it believable to land in Germany or land in Russia speaking English and not be noticed. So I just wanted to kind of bring that to the table with everybody, see if they've experienced the same thing, their feelings, you know, on past versus present, and kind of just get a vibe on why you think we're here and where you think we're going to go.
So, Brandon, like you, I remember the Godzilla movies, and I'm not talking about the one with Matthew Broderick or the ones that came after. I'm talking about the old Godzilla movies that came out in the 70s. And I enjoyed Godzilla, and it was also Gamera.
Yeah.
And that's another one. Mm-hmm. But I used to like those movies. And I do remember these films were dubbed. And by dubbed, we mean that they used a voiceover in order to translate what they were saying into the language of the country. And so they were done that way as opposed to subtitles. I think as a kid, if I watched a movie like that and had to rely on subtitles, it would have lost me. If I had to read while I watch, that would have lost me. But I certainly remember those movies, and I enjoyed them very much. And you're absolutely right, Brandon. The dubbing was not very good then. The dubbing was not very good then. But I didn't find that particularly problematic for me because I just enjoyed the action so much. You knew when they, Godzilla and they point, and for the most part, the monster was the action. Today, those films would certainly be considered dubbed very poorly. But I think it's interesting to historicize subtitles and dubbing even more. For example, Uncle Tom's Cabin was the first movie to have subtitles, and they called it intertitles. And so after a scene, then the next scene would be what was said in the previous dialogue. And then the next scene would show, and then there would be a screen after that to show what that dialogue was. And then came along the film The Jazz Singer, which had a little more advanced dialogue by that time. And that is when they began to put the subtitles in the scene itself, on the screen with the scene where that dialogue was occurring. So that is a huge advancement right there. I mean, can you imagine being at the theater and watching a film, and on the first screen you see, there's some dialogue going on, and then the next scene would be a screen that shows you what that dialogue was, and then the movie would continue. I mean, it seems like that would be very disruptive to the experience. of watching the film. And so advancing beyond that to being able to put the dialogue right on the screen is huge. The person they call the father of dubbing actually worked for Disney. His name was Eduardo Santos. And the first film they dubbed was Sleeping Beauty. We don't hear an awful lot about the names of people that contribute to, especially people of color that contribute to the development of these, technologies that have such, that have essentially made our lives easier, made our movie-going experiences increasingly better. And so it was very interesting to hear that it was a Hispanic person. But anyway, I thought it'd be very interesting to historicize dubbing and subtitling just a bit, so we know that we didn't just begin in 1970 and with Godzilla and Gamera movies.
Yeah. Weren't some of those old the Charlie Chaplin movies? Isn't that pretty much what they did? They had some theme going and people.
Yeah,
speaking,
they were.
And then they put up the
intertitled or Yeah.
Yeah, and what they're trying to do with dubbing is, as your dad said, with respect to the trying to maintain the authenticity of the film. And so if the film, for example, took place in Germany or it took place in Italy or whatever, there may be a certain flair about the way they speak. You want to try to maintain that authenticity when you dub that film, say, into English. The emotion of the original performance has to feed into the dubbing. And so I found that very interesting because I always saw dubbing as just, you just want to essentially repeat the dialogue in a different language. But it has to carry that culture and that emotion from the original film. And so that is the challenge of dubbing. Brandon, you pointed out earlier, when you talked about the Godzilla movies, for example, how long some of the words would be spoken by, say, one of the characters in the film, but yet by the time it was dubbed into English, for example, it was only 2 syllables, and you could tell the difference in the length of what they were saying, and it really had it really impacted, I think, the experience of watching the film. And so what the technologies have tried to do is to perfect that. So they consider context, they consider emotion, and they consider the length of what is being said by the original actor.
People speaking multiple languages, many times with subtitles, and it obviously it lends itself to the authenticity of it. Like you said, you can't have somebody as a spy in Germany, but everyone speaks English. I know they've done that before in movies, but yeah, it kind of makes it a little unauthentic, if you ask me.
There's a podcast where, and we'll put it in the show notes, but there is a podcast where the host talks about how she watched Sean Connery in the movie, one of the 007 movies.
Yeah.
And he was speaking in Italian, and she was very put off by that because it didn't carry like the accents correctly. It didn't carry the emotion, and so on and so forth. And so she found that problematic for her. One of the things she wanted to do was, let me see just how difficult it is to dub.
Oh.
And so she went into a studio with a person who's a specialist at dubbing to do some dubbing of just a line of film. And he showed her the scene, and she had to say that line into, whatever device, whatever technology they have. And she said, okay, how did I do? And he said, oh, you did okay. The bottom line is she did not consider the length of what was being said on screen. That was one. The other is she did not carry the emotion of the character on screen. And it took her a number of takes, along with some of the things he had to do in terms of adjusting knobs and all that stuff, to get that perfect. And so to your dad's point, dubbing is not easy. It is not an easy thing to do. It is a painstaking process, which is why, of course, AI is creeping into that area, perhaps it can make it more efficient. I'm not saying I agree with it, but it's no surprise that AI is coming into that area. And would people today have the tolerance for the techniques that were used back in the 70s? No, I don't think there's any way, those films could be successful.
Yeah, I think, in regards to some of those old attempts at dubbing, I think when you don't have a basis for comparison to, the most accurate version of it, it probably doesn't bother you as much. I think, Mom, that's why you said you enjoyed those old movies. It's kind of like video game graphics, before we had, modern, more fancy video game graphics, the old stuff was fine with us. We didn't really have a basis for comparison. So this is the best we got. This is the best we had to work with. It's the best thing we've seen. So I think it's one of those things where back then it probably didn't affect your viewing experience quite as much because that was the best attempt at it that you'd encountered thus far. Dubbing's interesting. And I know we're going to maybe talk about multilingual films and television shows. I mean, for me, one of the first things I remember, multilingual things I remember was the show Alias. And I'm sure that's not the first show, but the fact that it was, about this secret agent who was international. She would have all these missions in different countries and she would be having to switch languages a lot. I think, an example a little after that is just some of Quentin Tarantino's movies where he'll have, and Inglourious Basterds in particular, he had a lot of different languages spoken in there.
Yeah.
Das ist ein bisschen grob. Wer sind denn Ihre 3 Fashion-Begleiter?
Ich befürchte, dass keiner von Ihnen ein einziges Wort Deutsch spricht. Es sind Freunde aus Italien. Dies hier ist der hervorragende Sensationsdarsteller Enzo Gorloni. Ein sehr talentierter Kameramann, Antonio Margheriti, und Antonios Kameraassistent Dominique De Cocco. Signori, questo è un vecchio amico mio, Colonnello Hans Landa della SS.
Buongiorno. Signorini, piacere.
Kill Bill as well. And so I think, the multilingual films are definitely on the rise as well. But as far as dubbing, as you said, it's gotten better. I still find it a little distracting just because I just feel like even when it's pretty accurate in terms of the timing of when they say certain things, I feel like it's just so obviously a different voice to me that it can kind of take me out of it, and it takes away a little bit from the original acting performance that there was. So sometimes I personally would just prefer to put on the subtitles. I think some people feel like they have to catch everything when they put on the subtitles, and I feel like when you're watching anything, even if you miss something, in general, you can kind of get the sense of. I feel like well written, directed, and well acted stuff. You can kind of just tell from context what's going on a little bit, even if you miss a subtitle here or there. So I kind of prefer subtitles over dubs personally, but I do love that we have increasingly have the options for both people who are hard of hearing, for people who have poor vision, or who just want to be able to choose between one or the other. So, I'm glad that there's been technological advances, but I think we as viewers adjust to whatever the best version we've encountered thus far is the best we got, and I don't think and so I think that's why it's easy to enjoy that older stuff at the time.
Yeah. As you said, technology obviously plays a huge factor in what's acceptable and even what the improvements are in terms of those techniques. But one of the podcasts that I listened to that your mom suggested was talking just about the technology of AI and how they're improving dubbing to the point where it almost sounds exactly like Robert De Niro speaking Spanish. So, they have some interesting things that we can get into in terms of the technology and the filmmaker who's responsible for a company now that's improving that technology and putting it into film. But yeah, I just want to say that the advancements in technology have made both subtitling and dubbing much better.
One thing about subtitles for me is the first time I can remember experiencing it on a full-on standpoint. Chris, you brought up Quentin Tarantino. He did the movie Hero with Jet Li back in 2002. And I watched that movie off the recommendation of a friend. And at the time, I was young. So I had a narrow perspective on I don't feel like reading my movies. And I understand people not wanting to spend the entire time reading the movie. And what I've learned watching this one, number one, it's an excellent movie. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. I went with both eyes wide open, though, because it's done in Mandarin, because it's set in ancient China. And so for the nearly 2-hour-long experience, you will be reading the entire thing. And I understand people saying that they're not fast readers. My problem wasn't that I'm not a fast reader. It's more that after spending over an hour of reading, I got slower. I got a little fatigued and such, and so it made it harder to keep up with. And so that is why I tend to go away from watching full-on experiences that are done with subtitling. But that doesn't change the fact that it's amazing, because what it did was, and what I enjoyed is I felt more immersed in the experience, because I'm listening to it in the language of the time that this piece occurred. And I think that's a huge thing with subtitles that allows us to do it. It makes the world building even better.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, and to me, that kind of that's an interesting point. Because I wanted to mention this earlier. I was thinking about it before we were doing the podcast. Was that I do feel like in the kind of debate of subtitles or dubs, I do feel like the genre of the movie or just the style of that particular movie can kind of play a part in which I'd prefer. I think generally I would prefer subtitles. I think certain movies, there might not be a lot of dialogue. There might not be a lot of, or if there is, it's spaced out, or it's, I'll think of a movie like, Castaway or something, for instance. You have a movie where it's essentially a one character movie, obviously the beginning and end a little otherwise, but I feel like that's a kind of movie where it's like, okay, well, it's easy for me anyway to do subtitles for that, because there's just one person speaking. Whereas you take something like Gilmore Girls or some kind of Aaron Sorkin project where it's just so much quipping and there's so much back and forth and there's so much, fancy words being used. That makes subtitling a little bit tougher, I think. So I feel, so to me, I generally prefer subtitling, but I think it does depend on the genre of the movie or just the style of whatever I'm watching.
Yeah.
I love that you said that, bro, because so I'm trying to figure out how I want to take this. Real quick, some of what turned me off of dubbing when I was younger is very simple, and it was, Chris, I'm sure you'll agree with me on this one. The movie Major League from 1989, and I understand that there's a lot of colorful language in the original, and it suits the movie when you get to watch it in its entirety. But whenever you watch it on television, they have to edit it out. Nowadays, they tend to just go over the words. They just cut the word and move on to the next thing. But I remember Chris and I, we crack up every single time, because there's a point later on where there's a conversation with the pitcher on the mound, and the player says to the pitcher, "Strike this MF out." Okay, yes, I'm trying to edit myself here, so we're going to be good. But Chris and I die laughing because you watch it on TNT or whatever, and he's like, "Strike this guy out." because they try to stretch it and they're trying to hold his mouth a certain sort of way, whatever. And like, that's not necessarily dubbing, but the point is that they do this editing and all that stuff, and it just didn't sound right. Yeah. It just didn't fit. And so from that point, any type of dubbing kind of has just not been my jam. Yeah. However, Chris, you brought up Aaron Sorkin, and one thing I gotta say, like, I think the part that I learned that I enjoyed having multiple languages in productions was watching The West Wing. You know, The West Wing is, you know, they are in the White House. You've got the president, and the president always has to entertain foreign dignitaries. And they often would have a person there speaking their native language with a translator, which is real life.
Okay. Sorry I'm late. I'm Josh Lyman.
Disculpe mo atraso, mio nome è Josh Lyman.
Mahasaya Tile. Amisaya Josh Lyman. It's going to take a while. Prazer em conhecê-lo.
Pleased to meet you.
Are you enjoying the evening?
Josh, this isn't really the best context for chit-chat, you know what I mean?
Mandy's pretty upset. You
talked to him?
I didn't do a great job.
I didn't like the salmon.
He's answering a question from like a half an hour ago. Mr. Bambang.
Why don't we just speak in English?
Donna.
I was told that
Yes?
you should keep in mind all the things I do right.
Yes.
And I realized at that point, like, I love that because that is really what the world is like. I don't want a watered down version of it. Give me the real deal. So that was my first experience, and that's why from that point on, I've really enjoyed that any type of production and make sure that it feels real world.
Yeah. You know, interesting, the whole thing about dubbing, you guys have talked about the various issues with dubbing just from the listening point of view, but I was, again, like 10,000 things in film that I learn more about. I'm just amazed at the amount of detail and just the I don't know what a better term for it is, the amount of things that go into creating something, and dubbing is not easy. It's not simple by any stretch of the imagination. There are issues in terms of when you're dubbing an entire movie, dialects, because if you're doing it for multiple languages, well, even within that language, you know, there are dialect issues that you can run into in terms of the audience that you want to present it to. There's obviously the matching of the words is the hardest thing to overcome. But I found it real interesting that one issue were political reasons. Mussolini required that movies that were played in Italy were dubbed in Italian. They had to be that way. So, you know, there are various reasons why movies are dubbed, mostly for audience reach, but others are political. And then it just comes with the whole industry of dubbing. There are lots of people that are employed to do that. Mm-hmm. A ton of people. I mean, you think about a movie that when you see credits roll up at the end of either a TV series, an episode of a TV series or a movie, you see some of the languages that they're doing, and that can last for like 15 minutes, the end of what it's doing, just rolling through all the various languages and the actors that they had doing the voices for those. To me, that's incredible. But back to this guy that I was talking about with this new software and whatnot, they're, again, as always, they're looking for ways of making things more efficient. Interestingly enough, I don't remember if he concedes that it might put some people out of work, but what he was trying to do was to sort of marry this and have the best of both worlds in terms of presenting it as a tool for actors and directors as opposed to something for replacing jobs. His thing was that, like the instance I mentioned where they go back and they dub things for various versions because they want to speak these words, so they record them and then they have a tough time matching that, as you guys pointed out, into the movie. Well, if they can use this technology that they're developing to make it almost seamless, he's saying that the actors should still get paid for their contributions to that. And if it's done synthetically, they should be in on that payment. You know, the savings that they're doing, it still should go to the actors / directors. You know, you're streamlining your process, you're making it more efficient, but you shouldn't do it in the vein of cutting people out. I thought that was an interesting take on that.
A lot of these recording sessions where they either dub or they kind of fix these issues are called ADR sessions, automatic dialogue replacement. And yeah, as Mom mentioned, they can be pretty arduous and time consuming and kind of just very taxing. And I think when you get actors in this room trying to essentially replicate their own performance in a way, or someone else's performance, maybe it's tough. I mean, you know, I'm curious how often actors actually work on that as they're learning the craft of acting. When you're a young actor, you're thinking about being in front of the camera and having a scene partner and things like that. And that's the kind of stuff you spend a lot of your time on. I don't know how many of them practice, you know, just speaking into a microphone, essentially trying to replicate themselves on screen or replicate the person that they're doing dubs for. And so I think it can be tough, not only just because of the actual accuracy, the precision that it takes, but also just you're getting, you know, a professional who spends most of their time training on every other aspect of that craft, you know, that's trying to do this. And so, you know, obviously the further they get into their career, the more often they've probably done it. But that's just another challenge that dubbing probably poses.
Yeah. The podcast your mother mentioned, the guy kind of referred to it as method acting with voice. And in that, he was talking about exactly what you mentioned earlier in terms of trying to nail it. Positioning is important when you're trying to replicate something that someone's doing in a given scene. You know, if they're lying on their back, well, their voice is going to be different than it is standing up and talking into a mic. So there's all these little nuances that you have to take into account when you're trying to replicate that. So to everyone's point, not easy.
Yeah. The physicality aspect is very interesting. Someone's bending down to pick something up while they're talking. Their voice is very different than, to your dad's point, when they're, you know, standing up straight. And so that has to be captured in the dubbing if we want to be sure it's authentic. And so it's quite nuanced, really.
To add on to that, what they said was typically it takes 4 to 5 days to dub a given actor's voice and 2 weeks for an entire project. So there's not a lot of time. So there are, I'm sure, long hours spent trying to nail these things.
Yeah, and all of that is after, if you think about this, all of that is after the film is completed.
Yeah, and sometimes that even includes rewriting or redoing some parts of the work because they're trying to make it fit culturally in the given language that they're trying to do. So, again, mass amounts of detail that go into trying to do just a small segment of movie making.
I wanted to touch on one last thing before we were done talking. So I've mentioned how I have really enjoyed that the movie-going experience, the cinematic experience as a whole, because they've made it multilingual and, you know, it's all part of that world building. And in addition to that, we have to tip our caps to the actors that are executing these roles now as well, because they are doing things that they're speaking more than their native language. In a lot of cases, they are not bilingual people, but they are learning how to say these lines, these specific lines in those different languages as somebody from those countries would. So they're not just, it's not an American accent over a Russian, you know, phrase or anything like that. They're having full-on conversations and they have to make sure that they sound authentically Russian or French or German. You know, pick your country. And I'm impressed by all those things. When we talk about world building, and we talk about being impressed by these actors, I go back to Lord of the Rings. Because in this case, to immerse us into the world of this movie, these people are speaking a bunch of languages that aren't real.
Yeah.
Elvish language, dwarf language, like they're they're speaking a bunch of created languages for this movie, and it was an epic tale. So that was among the first experiences for myself to realize that, like I said, again, for myself, I love the world building aspect of making sure we're speaking those kinds of languages. I also want to specifically shout out Kevin Bacon in a separate production, because for myself, I came away even more impressed by him. He's been in a million things, maybe even 1,000,001 at this point. But X-Men First Class, his character is meant to be a Nazi. I don't think he was a general, but he was a Nazi fighter, and he was a part of their science division. And so for a very large chunk of that movie, he is speaking German, and I thought it was I had to look it up and figure out, is Kevin Bacon actually from Germany? Because they spend a very good portion at the beginning of that movie where he is speaking exclusively German. And then later in the film, when there's he gets reconnected with a character. I'm trying hard not to give away a lot of even though the movie's been out for a long time. But later, he and another character reconnect. And immediately, his German accent comes back, speaking English, but it sounded normal.
My name is Sebastian Shaw. And I am not here to hurt you.
Breathe!
Azazel? My friends, there's a revolution coming when mankind discovers who we are, what we can do. Each of us will face a choice. Be enslaved or rise up to rule. Choose freely, but know that if you are not with us, then by definition, you are against us.
And I'm sure as an actor, he personally decided to do that, to make sure that his character still came across as authentically German before having more of an Americanized experience later, because at this point it's set several decades later. So I say all that to say that, like I said, Kevin Bacon is one of those experiences, one of those actors, and the actors from Lord of the Rings, where I was like, we have to tip our caps to these guys because of how much effort and energy that they put into making sure they execute these characters so that we feel like they are exactly from where they're from.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned some of the movies, Brandon, in the process of preparing some of the reviews on Cup of Tea Critiques. I'm sure Chris as well. We've both watched. I won't call them foreign language films anymore because by the time we see them, they've been dubbed. I can't recall a film we've reviewed where I have been distracted by the dubbing, by the quality of the dubbing. It just shows you just how advanced the technology and how skilled the technicians have become in getting this right. I think about, there's a movie in Syria, for example, that I reviewed, and it turns out that was done in Arabic, but it was dubbed in English when I watched it, and there is nothing to indicate that this film was done in any language other than English, which shows you just what an exquisite job they did with this. That was a theatrical release. I think about another one, Saint Omer, about a woman who was on trial for sadly drowning her child. And during her testimony in the courtroom, she had to speak, obviously she was speaking French, and she spoke it just beautifully. I mean, it was just the way it flowed. It was just spoken beautifully. And so that film was not dubbed, at least not the version I watched. It was not dubbed. It had subtitles.
Est-ce que vous faites en sorte que personne ne remarque cette grossesse ni ne la voit?
Je me suis comportée comme si je n'étais pas enceinte, pas parce que je voulais pas qu'on le voie.
Une fois enceinte, avez-vous vu un médecin?
Je n'ai pas vu de médecin. Je n'ai rien dit à personne.
Comment s'est déroulé l'accouchement?
Lily est née à l'atelier, j'ai accouché seule.
Pourquoi vous ne vous rendez pas à l'hôpital?
Je sais pas, j'étais dans un trou noir. Je sortais pas. Je voyais personne. Et puis j'avais peur pour Lily, je voulais la protéger.
La protéger de quoi?
De la malveillance.
Normally I am distracted by subtitles, but I was not here, which shows you just, I guess once you get comfortable watching the foreign language film, and you accept that that's going to come with subtitles, it almost seems seamless. It's not a problem going from the visual to the words. It's very easy to go from the visual to the words. Faithfully Yours, I'll mention one more, a movie called Faithfully Yours that was done in Dutch, actually, but that was dubbed in English. You would never know they're speaking any language other than English. And so the technicians and the quality of the technology for dubbing has just gotten really good. It's gotten really, really good.
Real quick, with the AER sessions, it's usually a collaborative effort with the director, the editor, the sound engineer, and if there is a replication of different sound effects that are in the scene, footsteps, something like that, those are done by what are called a Foley artist. So those are some of the professionals that are involved in kind of either, recreating either the sound effects or the dialogue that are in certain scenes. And a lot of times a post-production coordinator or a supervisor will be responsible for actually scheduling and organizing those ADR sessions, getting everybody there and figuring out times and stuff like that. So those are some of the professionals that are involved in it.
That's good to know. So it truly is a team effort. It's not just a technician and some technology. It truly is a team effort. We've talked a lot about, dubbing, subtitling, and a little bit about closed captioning. With respect to people who might be mildly visually impaired, we take for granted as, sighted people take for granted that they can see films. And people who are hearing enabled take for granted that they can hear what is being said or the action and or the footsteps and so on, the other things that are going on in the film. We kind of take that for granted. And I just want to point out that there's segments of people that have trouble enjoying the movie watching experience because they're either hearing impaired or they're visually impaired. And that's being soft about it. Let's say for people who are blind, it's very difficult for them to, engage in this experience. I said all that to say that I listened to a podcast episode. This episode was called Sound Cinema, Experiencing Film Through Audio Description. And it's by a person named Matthew Schifrin, who is blind. And he does a wonderful job of talking about how he likes movies and would enjoy the experience of watching movies. And he goes back to when he was, 5 years old and how he would, watch TV at his grandmother's and he would hear commercials, for example, because he has his hearing, but he would hear commercials and hearing the sounds and commercials, let's say of sounds of cartoon advertisements, etc., meant nothing to him because he couldn't relate it to anything visual. He said TV commercials were his version of window shopping. He could not understand what was going on in cartoons when he would watch cartoons because he had no visual for it. And so there's a friend of the family, as he got older, there's a friend of their family, a person he called Ben, and who loved movies, and he would go to the show with his friends a lot. And one day he asked Ben if he could tag along. And so he tagged along with Ben to see The Avengers. And he asked Ben, would he mind describing what's going on screen? And what Ben did, he said what he did is he obviously sat next to each other and he leaned very close to Ben so that and they told the people around them at the theater that, by the way, he is going to be talking to me because I can't see, so he's going to be relating to visual elements on screen. And so everybody around them would know what was going on as they would hear Ben whisper what is going on the screen. And he added that Ben speaks very fast, and he did some of that in the podcast. Ben was speaking a little fast on the podcast, so we understand what the speed of his voice sounds like. And so he's watching the Avengers, he's hearing the Avengers, and he's got Ben explaining what is going on screen. And so he's laughing along with everybody else in the theater at funny scenes. And he is in anticipation that, wondering what's going to happen at the high point of the movie. He was, listening with bated breath because he had a visual to relate the audio to. And I thought that was very interesting. Now, obviously, they have developed, earphone technology for what they call audio descriptions. had said that does what Ben was doing. So he could now go to the movies. Anyway, I thought that was just an incredible story. He gave an awful lot of history around the development of this type of technology. The question was, how do we make movie theaters accessible to people who are blind? And so there's this technology now, obviously, that does that. And so it's just a wonderful thing. It's just a really wonderful thing. To backtrack, in the late 90s, VHS tapes came out with audio descriptions. And Matt said he went to the library and he rented every kind of movie you can imagine. Every kind of movie that you can imagine. And one of his first was The Lion King. And so he could now take The Lion King home on VHS and put on this device and enjoy The Lion King. And so I thought I just thought all of that was just very, very interesting, that this kid could talk about what his experiences were, not being able to enjoy films in a way that we take for granted. And so I'm glad there's technology that allows them to do that now. I don't know if I explained any of that very well at all, but let me just add one more thing. He said Titanic was the first to send tapes to be audio described for theaters. And that was it. Titanic was the key to advancing that technology. One of the first films he saw in the theater when he was 7 years old was Madagascar. He said he finally got to experience, going to the theater to see Madagascar, he was able to experience powerful speakers, the smell of popcorn, the sense of community and purpose that occurs at the theater. Everybody came there to see that movie, and so he got to fully participate in that as a result of this technology. So it allowed him to be immersed in films, immersed in the experience of movie watching. So the question became, will studios give the developers of these technologies the movies in advance in time for them to do what they need to do so that, people like Matt could then take their devices to the theaters and enjoy the movie like everybody else. And he just thanked this guy who developed this technology. He said, "Thank you for letting blind people watch movies just like sighted people. It means a lot." But we take movie watching for granted because we are, thankfully we are sighted. We have our hearing. But for people who are disabled in those ways, how can they enjoy the movie watching experience like we do? So I just love that there's, some companies that have taken on that, and that studios are helping them to do that.
Going to say, in some of the theaters, I know AMC, for instance, has, Prime, something called Prime, where they have these certain movies. They'll have, whether it's closed captions or audio descriptions available, like you said. And then, of course, there's 4DX theaters, which sometimes have, rumbling seats or different effects like that. And I think in a time where a lot of technological advances are things where people are objecting to them affecting the labor force, I think it's also good to remember that some of these technological advances are allowing people to be included in an experience that weren't allowed to be included before.
Yes. Yeah.
Thanks so much for listening to the Cup of Tea Critiques podcast. Honestly, we could go on and on like we do at our dinner table, but we appreciate you figuring out your cup of tea along with us. Make sure you rate and follow us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Also, leave a comment and tell us if you prefer dubbing or subtitles. You can stay in the loop on all things COTC by subscribing on our website at cupofteacritiques.com. You can also find us on Facebook, check out our Instagram at Cup of Tea Critiques, and on Letterboxd at COT Critiques. For Reba, Terry, and Chris, I'm Brandon. We'll see you next week for another deep look with a deep brew.